Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Bruce Stanger, and I am the Program Chair for Community Conversations on Racial Inequity. The Community Conversation series is presented by the Jewish Community Relations Council and the Jewish Leadership Academy, both part of the Jewish Federation of Greater Hartford. It is intended to shine a light on racism in America and the Jewish community's role in creating a more racially just society. We're grateful to Liberty Bank for making this series possible. Tonight's program is not only the first installment in our series, it also is the culmination of a journey that nearly 70 community members have been taking together this summer. We've been reading Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration, either with a synagogue or private book group, a Federation-run book group, or on our own. This evening, we'll hear from a panel of scholars who study the Great Migration and whose families were also participants. It is my pleasure to introduce my dear friend, David Brandwein, who will be moderator. David is a past chair of the Jewish Communities Relations Council and a member of Federation's Board of Directors. David is a retired attorney, and he has been active in interfaith and intercommunity relations for many years. David, here I'm passing it to you.
Thank you, Bruce, and good evening, everybody. It's so nice to see so many familiar names, not only from our local Jewish community, from elsewhere. It's especially nice to see some old friends from Wasco and from Faith Congregational Church. Hi. The Great Migration was the movement of at least 6 million African Americans between about 1916 and about 1970 out of the South, headed north, Midwest, and West, fleeing segregation, Jim Crow, white supremacy, and white mob violence, who denied them, among other things, and as full US citizens, the right to vote. For those of you who've been reading Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, you've learned about the Great Migration through the stories of 3 specific people who moved from the South to New York City, to Chicago, and out to Los Angeles between the late 1930s and the early 1950s. But there are millions of other stories, as I'm sure you can imagine, including the thousands who moved both to cities and rural areas within Connecticut. And tonight we're going to hear specifically about the migration to Connecticut and some family stories of a few of those people. Each of our panel tonight has multiple distinguished academic degrees, including doctorates, which I'm not going to repeat. They were in the flyer, but they are impressive. But they're also here for their own personal experiences or that of their families. First, Dr. Stacey Close is a native of Georgia. He's worked in higher education for more than 25 years, and currently serves as both Associate Vice President for Equity and Diversity at Eastern Connecticut State University and as a Professor of History at Eastern. Dr. Close has taught courses that focused on African American, African, and Southern history, including Black Hartford's freedom struggle. Among his honors is being named to the NAACP's 100 Most Influential Blacks in Connecticut. Dr. Constance Belton Green was born and spent her early formative years in Virginia during the 1950s. She's the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Connecticut School of Law and is the author of the recent book, Shall We Rise? African Americans at the University of Connecticut School of Law, published in 2019, which traces the history from the founding of the law school in 1921 to the present day, concentrating on some of her personal narratives from the late 60s and early 70s. And Dr. Benjamin Foster Jr. has worked in a variety of public policy positions and currently serves as an adjunct faculty member at Central Connecticut State University, teaching African American studies and religion. One of his relatives, the Reverend Richard A.G. Foster, who was originally from Wilson, North Carolina, served as pastor in North Carolina in the late 1930s before moving to New Haven, where he became a leader for equal rights and social justice from his pulpit and throughout the New Haven area and in Connecticut in the 1940s and 1950s. So welcome, all of you. It's good to see you again. We're first going to hear from Dr. Close on the why, the how, and the when African Americans, part of the Great Migration, came to Connecticut. And then we'll ask each of our panelists to share some of their personal stories. So Dr. Close is first going to provide an overview for maybe 15 minutes or so. And then we'll ask Drs. Greene and Foster to share some of their stories along with Dr. Close. And hopefully we'll have some time for some questions at the end of the program. Please type any questions you might have in the chat section. We are not making the live question function available. So if you want to ask a question, please type it into the chat and we'll try to get to it. Now, normally these panels have had a hard close at 8 o'clock, but depending on how things are going, the panel has agreed to go for another, few minutes after that. So we'll play it by ear as we get to 8 o'clock. Last reminder before I turn it over to Dr. Close is please remember to mute your audio if it's not already muted, and keep it muted so that we don't benefit from all of the background noise in your home rooms. So thank you. And Stacey, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me also thank not only David, but also Alana Butler and Jody Angel and Bruce Stenger and the Jewish Federation for the opportunity to speak with you tonight, and also to Dr. Foster and Dr. Greene. One of the reasons that this topic became so near and dear to me, I'll share with you really quickly. It was students at Eastern Connecticut State University when I was teaching my African American history courses. They wanted to know how Connecticut, and particularly African Americans in Connecticut, fit in with the greater story of African American history. And so that led me on excursions to the State Library, to the Connecticut Historical Society, and also to our vast array of census records that I looked at for my own research and things that I published, as well as talking to people who had lived the experience as well, that aided me in this discussion. Now, Isabel Wilkerson's work on the Great Migration is hugely important to this discussion, but so is that of scholars who come before, and I'll mention a few. But the Chicago story, most people know about the Great Migration. They know the role of the Chicago Defender and the Pullman Porters, as well as employment opportunities during World War I that were push and pull factors that led people out of the South to Chicago. But Connecticut's story is part of this Great Migration discussion as well. And it's an extremely important part of it because when you go back and look at the historical records, one of the titans of history of that period is Emmett J. Scott, the secretary for Booker T. Washington. And Emmett J. Scott collected a lot of letters from people who were talking about migration. And he argues that it was Connecticut's migration that was the first wave of the Great Migration. And that's Emmett Scott's, Booker T. Washington secretary's argument. But the movement from the South to the North by blacks during World War I is directly tied to a number of push or pull factors. One, of course, is economics. What you have in Connecticut in terms of tobacco during the period of World War I is that there's a labor shortage because of the loss of men from Lithuania, Poland, and Russia from the workforce in tobacco. And the Connecticut Tobacco Leaf Growers Association, they are looking for workers because they've lost hundreds of people. So they initially decide that what they are going to do to fill that void is to go to New York and recruit some 200 workers. Now, those recruitment efforts don't pay fruition. And what I mean by not paying fruition, there is one statement by the Connecticut Tobacco Growers Association that say that the women they recruited quickly proceeded to demoralize the town of Hartford. So having this problem before them, they then decide that the best way to try to address that is to turn to the National Urban League. And the National Urban League then connects them up with Black college presidents. And one of the first Black college presidents they connect up with is the legendary president of Morehouse College, John Hope. And John Hope will actually travel from the South to Connecticut to sign up 20 or so of his young men from Morehouse College to work tobacco. Now, as he understood it, it was not only a good way for them to have something to do during the summer, but it would also help them pay their tuition and fees at Morehouse College. It was something that was typical for Black college students of World War I period of the 20s, and even after that. You go north, you work, you make money, you go back down south, you pay tuition and fees. But as they came northward, behind them came other college students. You pick an HBCU that was around during this period, and you would have students from those HBCUs eventually coming to Connecticut to work tobacco, because the work was steady during the summer, and unlike sharecropping, you actually got paid. But along with the economics of that, you get the rank and file who come to find jobs where they get steady wages. But added to this mix of why people leave is also the sheer terror that they lived under during the Jim Crow system. This is the heyday of lynching and terror and violence against Blacks in the South. By the thousands during the period of Jim Crow, Blacks would be lynched and murdered for minor and trivial things of the day. And so there were people who left the South fearful of what might happen to them if they stayed. As they moved on, there were others who thought about education, because Black children in the South during the period of World War I, they went to school in the rural areas only when they weren't needed on their farms and on land. And so there was an opportunity for greater education in terms of just sheer seat time in classrooms. Along with that, people also were able to have visible and physical freedom. Visible and physical freedom, whereby which there were no signs that said colored only, and there were some opportunities. Now, while there's some opportunity in tobacco, what eventually happens is that other opportunities will open up in other places, particularly for Black men, like in the Edwin Taylor Lumber Company, Hartford Rubber Works, as well as the Taylor and Finn Company. Lower level entry positions, but positions nevertheless that people may not have gotten in the rural areas primarily where they came from. Now, the thing about the migration, where people migrate from, it's an area described by W.E.B. Du Bois when he talks about Southwest Georgia. He refers to it as the breadbasket of the Confederacy in its souls of Black folk. But it's also an area that's filled with very large plantations at one point in time in American history. And it's also an area whereby which landowners don't want people to leave. And so leaving the South, even though there are labor recruiters there, is quite difficult. I'll give you a couple of examples. In 1917 and 1918 in Americus Georgia, white landowners in Americus Georgia were so angry with people trying to migrate from the Americus Georgia area that they urged the police to go down to the train stations and physically stop them. And an entire trainload of Blacks who wanted to leave the area, they were arrested at gunpoint and urged at gunpoint that people should change their mind about leaving. People decided to leave anyway. The same was true when you looked at portions of Quincy, Florida, where whites in Quincy, Florida at gunpoint threatened Blacks who wanted to leave Quincy, Florida to come north to work tobacco. White landowners in and around Tallahassee, Florida took a different approach. They said their Black workers who worked tobacco in and around Tallahassee, Florida could go, but they would come with them to ensure that once they completed their work in Connecticut, they would then go back down to Tallahassee, Florida to work. Now, that's part of the terror that people had to deal with, but they still came on. And as they came on, they brought with them their cultural dimensions with them. They brought with them their religious worship style. They brought with them their singing style. They brought with them their dress style. They brought with them their style of speaking. They brought with them their style of farming, and had small mini farms and gardens all over the areas where they resided. And it was part of bringing their culture with them. And when I talked to older gentlemen some years ago, one of the things they brought with them was their love of the outdoors. They continued to fish and they continued to hunt. And when I asked specifically, where do you hunt in Connecticut if you are living in Hartford? And they said the prime hunting land for us was Bloomfield, Connecticut. And what I noticed in the backyards of almost every elderly person I interviewed, they had these dog houses. And I assumed they were the houses for protection, but the older residents told me, no, we always kept hunting dogs around in our yards. And so along with that, you'll also get men who bring their love of golf as well as part of their movement from north to south. But as they move, they also find that this increased population is disturbing to whites in Connecticut and also to some Blacks. And I'll give you a quick example of what I mean by that. What is disturbing to a number of whites, because there are whites from the South who are migrating as well, there's a great concern about Black and white children going to school together. And there will be efforts to try to segregate Southern Black children away from other children as the migration continues around 1917, 1918. That effort plays a part in eventually having the Connecticut NAACP established, because Mary Townsend Seymour, the great founder of the Hartford NAACP, she decides to contact W.E.B. Du Bois about an effort that she learns about to segregate Connecticut schools. And so the migration plays a part in the birth of Connecticut's NAACP. Now, as far as political change, the migration also brought political change. The Black community was primarily Republican before the migration. But as migrants come from the South, there's a movement over to the Democratic Party. And Mary Parkman Watson says, she was a leading Democratic politician among Blacks at the time. She said, the movement really begins around 1928, not in 32, but she says as early as 1928, there's a movement from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. It's about an issue of jobs, but it's also about an issue of access to jury roles and jury time as well. Well, as migrants continue to move northward, they will discover that there are tensions that emerge in terms of Black church folk, because Black church folks from the South, their worship time is a little longer. Their way of preaching style is a little different. And it's also as a result of this migration that the Holiness Pentecostal movement will come to Connecticut as well. The Church of God and Saints in Christ, they are all part of this migration. And their worship is different from what a number of established Black churches have experienced before. And so those tensions exist as well. But what you find as far as Black Americans who are migrating, their children become a part of the city's as well as the state's transformation in terms of the military. By the time you get to World War II, Black men have served during World War I, but during World War II, the numbers jump dramatically. But the migration continues through the 30s, and Connecticut, that it once had a population of hundreds, by the time you get to the 1930s, 1940s, you are talking about tens of thousands of people who are primarily migrants. When Charles Johnson does his study in 1923, he pointed out that you had migrants from Georgia, you had migrants from North Carolina, you had migrants from Virginia, and almost every Southern state who were in Connecticut. The largest contingent was from Georgia, but other states were present as well. And as Connecticut as a whole, you find that certain cities in certain states were considered to be a North Carolina city or a Virginia city. The migration to Waterbury was considered to be a North Carolina migration. Hartford was different in terms of the multiplicity of states that were involved. New Haven was a bit different. New London was considered to be primarily a Georgia migration as far as this period of the Great Migration. But as the migrants came on, their political power would begin to emerge. Their political power emerges because of that change that emerged, but it also emerges because of a major event that occurs in 1943. It's in 1943 that Reverend John Jackson, who was a minister at Union Baptist Church at the time, was going to the National Baptist Convention, and he would be attacked and beaten aboard a train. That beating would forge an alliance between different portions of the community that was progressive. Some who wanted the Justice Department to step in and do something, others who were fearful of race riots in Hartford, and thus you get the formation of the Interracial Commission, and later on the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities is what eventually is formed out of all of this as far as name. But it's this migration that will also give Connecticut the chance to host a young Martin King in 1944 and 46. It's also this migration that will allow for the political emergence of the Reverend Robert Moody, Wilbert X. Johnson, as well as John Clark and the legendary Bosch Barlow to the state legislature. It will be the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of those migrants from World War I who in the 1960s, they became the visible agents of protest. They became the face of the civil rights movement. It will be folks like Wilbur Smith and the young people in CORE and also the young people in NECAP. They became the migrants, protesters of their generation, but not necessarily migrants. And this migration would also lay the groundwork for the election of both Thurman Milner as well as Carrie Saxon Perry. Because by the time you get to the 60s and the 70s, as the migration continues, there are job opportunities opening up. There are educational opportunities opening up. This is not to say that there wasn't a connection still with the South, with people going back and forth to the South, either by train or by car. And those connections remained. And migration, the story of Connecticut's migration, while it's fueled in large part by economics, while it's fueled in part by a fear of violence, there is also part of it that is perceived of, particularly by church folks, it is perceived of as an exodus of sorts, an exodus to a land that is somehow much better than what people had in the South. But those connections to the South still remain. And so with that, David, I think I may have gone a little bit over my time.
No, that was absolutely wonderful. And thank you for condensing what was probably a 6-hour series of talks into that. And it opens up so many other questions, but let's move on. Connie, you want to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about what brought you to Connecticut and what you experienced when you got here?
Yeah, so my story, actually, let's start back a little bit. I came to Connecticut in 1969, but I'd like to go back to the period of 1954 and Virginia during that period, because that would be still the height of segregated schools. And one thing in my family, education and graduate school education was very important. So I followed, I believe, in the footsteps of my father, who received his master's degree in 1954 from Teachers College, Columbia University, under a program where Virginia and other southern states who did not want to integrate their graduate school programs paid the tuition of Black students to go to northern schools, and pretty much Ivy League schools. States were paying the tuition. So that was pretty much my first introduction to the possibilities of graduate school education. And in 1954, I was in first grade. So, but that idea of there are other avenues outside of Virginia for that quest for education. Remember, I said my family was the strivers of education. My father was the principal of my neighborhood elementary school when I was in Virginia. My aunt was the first Black woman doctor in our town. So that striving for education was very key to my migration story. So why Connecticut? In 1969, I came to Connecticut because primarily in looking at law schools to go to, and at that time, the University of Virginia had opened up for Black students, but UConn was doing a major push to integrate a school, law school that really had not been integrated earlier. So they were seeking Black students. I was an honors student. There were several choices, and UConn actually gave a full scholarship and tuition scholarship. It wasn't very much. I think it was $300 it cost at the time, right? But also a stipend for housing. But again, the thread of education was one of the stories, I think, at the end of migration, where a number of students that I found why they came to Connecticut was really this idea of graduate school education. And many of them were from the South, and the opportunities of once you left the South seemed to be greater for graduate school education. I want to read you one short little story from this book. It's my story, but I'm going to read you a little short piece on what I found when I first got to Connecticut. And it's around the issue of education and housing. So I'll just take a minute. Our first task was to find housing. Late in August 1969, my father and I drove from our family home in Portsmouth, Virginia, to find a place for me to live. We had an appointment with Lane, the assistant dean of the law school, who gave us a list of rooms and third floor attic apartments available to rent in the neighborhood surrounding the law school, West Hartford campus. This is University of Connecticut Law School. Remember, it used to be up around, up Asylum Avenue, up on that area. Okay. It seemed a safe and convenient solution to my housing needs. Remember, I'm a young Black woman, just graduated from college, age 21 going on 22, and going to a state I'd never been to before. My father and I knocked on the door of one of the first homes on the list. We were curtly told that no room was available. We knocked on the front doors of several other homes on the list. We were told again and again that no room was available, or the owners had decided not to rent to a law student this year. Without saying a word, I had only to look at the knowing disappointment in my father's eyes. That list had not been meant for me. It was a revelation. I had been an honors student at Hampton Institute, an exchange student at Cornell University. I had completed an independent study abroad program in Athens and Thessaloniki, Greece. I thought I understood how to navigate different environments, including living in a culture different from my own. I eventually found a place to live on Collins Street in Hartford, just 2 miles from the law school. Unfortunately, the tradition of giving a list of rentals and homes to incoming students persisted for many more years. And that's just my story. But what I did in looking at part of this late migration story of looking for graduate schools is I interviewed other people like Justice Vanessa Bryant, who's a federal court judge. And she told the same story of this question of housing. Once you got to Connecticut, of where can you live, particularly for Black women, it became an issue. But her story, almost 7 to 8 years later, was identical to my story. So that idea of coming to Connecticut, being equipped to be here, but then how do you fit into an environment? How do you create a community? How do you find belonging? Were issues during that early time that were really important. I didn't think of much when growing up about Connecticut. I'm flipping back to the early years, but I just wanted to see that impression of Connecticut. But growing up, I didn't think as much about Connecticut, but I did think about New York. We had family that had moved to New York probably in the 1930s and 40s. So New York City became a place to go in the summers. And that's why I think my father, when he had an opportunity to get a master's degree, New York was a perfect choice for that. Again, the North was much more open for graduate education. There were limitations on the kind of graduate school education that you could go to. The South did offer undergraduate schools because there were a number of historically Black colleges in the South. I attended Hampton Institute, that became Hampton University, but there were a number, Howard University was another big one, but there were a number of historically Black colleges in the South, but the question became graduate school education, and pretty much everyone in my family who wanted to go to graduate school ended up coming north for one of those opportunities. I also reference one other thing that you can take a look at. It's an earlier Connecticut Explored article, and it's on a woman by the name of Betsy Bennett. And Betsy Bennett is an important person to know. During her lifetime, she was the first African-American woman, Black woman, to become a member of the Connecticut Bar in 1974. And Betsy's story, why I pulled that out a minute, you can, on page 17 of that, it's spring 2014, that particular article that I wrote about her. She was born in Prairie View, Texas in 1938. Her father was a college professor in Texas. Her mother was a librarian. Clearly they were in segregated colleges, but they were, again, education was key to a number of Black families in the South. Betsy came north at the age of 16. Again, she came by herself. She attended Radcliffe College, was admitted to Harvard Law School, actually, but ended up marrying her sweetheart. They moved to Hartford, Connecticut. Thus, she ended up going to UConn Law School a little bit later. But that idea of, for graduate school at least, that there were a number of people like myself, it was not so unusual to want to get a graduate education, and the possibilities of that occurring were much more open in some of the northern states. Connecticut was probably, for graduate education, in terms of the State University, University of Connecticut, was one of the later ones that actually had Black students. The law school was one of the later ones to enter. There were other schools, NYU, for example, Columbia University. Constance Baker Motley had attended Columbia University back in the 1940s. There were other graduate schools in other states that were a little ahead of Connecticut in terms of that process. So in the year 1969, that to me really doesn't seem that long ago, but I guess it is now, right? But in that year, I was an oddity. There was no community. We had to figure out a community. We had to connect to the Hartford community, which I think we all did. And I like to, now I sometimes speak about creating belonging. How do you do that when you come to an area that you don't know well? And that's part of the migration story, but it's also the story of just even students who may be coming later, first time students here from another place. And that idea of belonging, how do you create that belonging so that you want to stay, so that you want to be here? And for me, it was more around marriage. Met my husband here, family, it was around career. I did start out practicing law, moved into education much later in life of, college education. But church became really important. Finding a church that you were a part of became very important to that. And actually developing a community. I remember meeting people like Bo Spallo and others in the community who reached out to new people in the area like myself. And then I had the belonging piece because I married a Hartford guy, so that was part of what was here too. What I wanted to just do is one other quick thing to note that there is an ongoing tie to the South. I think we gravitate back to what we knew, but there were experiences that were actually quite lovely. And then there were other experiences that were actually violent and horrible. But the family experiences of one, the connections of family, the sense of high expectations came from family first, were very much a part of my Southern experience. And now what I find a phenomena that's really going on is a lot of those people that I've known for years who've lived here 50 years or more are migrating back to the South. They're retiring back there to either the states where they lived or other states. Right now, for example, South Carolina is very popular. That people are retiring back to, and North Carolina are very popular, and Virginia. I grew up around the Tidewater area, so you got that wonderful water. That people are returning to the South, bringing on that transplant that really is, when you go back to some of the areas, they're very vibrant now. They're not the South that I recall back in the 1950s.
So, Dr. Green, you're actually raising a number of questions that some people have already posted that hopefully we'll have some time to get to. But
Okay.
The other thing is, while Dr. Foster is now going to share some of his experiences, a couple of people have asked if you could type into the chat the Connecticut Explored citation about Betsy Bennett. If you could just type in the name of the magazine and what year, what edition, whatever information you have.
Okay.
So
all
thanks.
right. I will do that. Sure.
And now, Dr. Foster, if you want to unmute and share some of your experiences.
Those are very hard acts to follow. Both were just excellent. I had the privilege and honor of meeting Dr. Greene in 1969. I doubt if she remembers, but it was at the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. I believe you were doing something there at that time, Connie, but I was working there and had the opportunity to meet you. Dr. Close was a breath of fresh air. We met several years ago. I must say that he was a very eager learner and wanted to know more about the people who settled in Hartford from the South. Let it be known that Dr. Stacey Close is the first African-American to record information about African-Americans in Hartford. I had the pleasure of sharing with him oral traditions that I had come upon from barbershops, from talking to older men and women. And it seemed that everybody who was a longtime resident of Hartford came from Georgia. And I believe it was about 4 or 5 counties. Is that right, Dr. Close? 4 or 5 counties. But let me preface all my remarks by giving a shout out to 2 friends of this community, and that's Attorney Howard Klebanoff and former Mayor Sandy Klebanoff. They were very helpful and are long-time friends. My journey to Connecticut started when I was a little boy. I had an aunt and uncle who came for me every other summer. They had no children. And so every other summer, they would come to Raleigh and manage to talk my mother into allowing me to come and spend a few weeks with them in Hartford. And thus I began to know North Hartford, the north end of Hartford. My father was a career Marine. He retired and relocated our family here. We settled initially in the Kennedy Street area. That was tenement housing, multifamily dwellings. And it was also a community that I referred to as a mini United Nations at that time. And I'm referring to the late 50s and early 60s. You had people living there who were from Poland, Italians, and other people that we had to become familiar with. The South was merely Black and white. We didn't know ethnicities. So that was something that we had to learn. But the vast majority of the community were Southern Blacks. So we didn't have a lot of transition to undergo in that neighborhood at the time. The reason why my family came to Hartford is that my father was the youngest of his siblings, and 3 or 4 of them had located to the Hartford area. They came initially to work in the tobacco industry. You see, I had a cousin who had been sent to pastor the historic Warwick Memorial African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in New Haven. I write about him in this edition of Connecticut Explored. But Richard A.G. Foster worked in New Haven for 12 years. He became the second African-American alderman in the city of New Haven. He was a Republican, but he did so much for the African-American community. He was one of those students that Dr. Close talked about earlier. He was a student at Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina. He came initially as a worker in the tobacco fields. He would later tell all of his relatives, and there were many, that there were economic opportunities in Connecticut.
Okay.
And so many came to work in the tobacco industry in Hartford County and New Haven County. And so we had Fosters in New Haven and in Hartford. Many would return to North Carolina in the winter and come back and work in the summers. But in the 40s, many began to stay and they found jobs in the factories. Taylor and Finn, as was previously mentioned, the railroads, and other manufacturing entities. So I found Connecticut to be extremely fruitful for those of us who migrated in terms of education and economics. But there was a longing, oftentimes, for the people back home. You see, there was the institutions that we left. It was the other family and friends. Those who left were looking for economic opportunity. Those who stayed, I believe, had more substance in terms of property, education, status within the community, and other factors that caused them to stay. But it was the institutions that we missed most. It took my grandmother, who we finally was able to talk into coming what she called up south, several years before she found a church that was similar to the church she left in Raleigh, and it was the Union Baptist Church. I was able to gain a high school education, the first in my immediate family to do so. But I had no African-American teachers during my tenure at Hartford Public High School. I would not attend college before I had served my military experience. Trinity College became my home base. And there I was able to excel and do exceptionally well. Wesleyan was my next stop, where I earned a graduate degree in history. Along the way, I managed to obtain jobs in public policy, later in education. I was the first African-American to serve as principal planning analyst for human services at the State Office of Policy and Management. Education and education administration drew me in because I wanted to try and make a difference with young people. I believe that the migration, which is the greatest internal migration in modern history, served many, many purposes for those of us who left the lower and the deep South, the lower and the upper South. I have to distinguish because there were distinct differences between what was happening in certain parts of the South as opposed to other parts of the South. I have a tendency to look back on my time in the South today as I've reached my 7th decade with mixed emotions. I think about the racial division, the water fountains, the colored-only restrooms, and not being able to go to the movies and other places, even in a capital city like Raleigh. I was born on the campus of a small African-American Episcopalian college known as St. Augustine's, now known as St. Augustine's University. That was considered a big feat because so many of the children who were born in that county were born at home. We had one hospital, and it was on that campus, St. Augustine's campus, St. Agnes Hospital, the only hospital for African Americans in the largest county at that time in the state. We had 2 higher education institutions, Shaw University, the oldest African-American institution of higher education in the South, and St. Augustine's College. So we had exposure to lots of culture. We had exposure to the fraternity groups, and we would often see them on the campus. I lived in the neighborhood of St. Augustine's, so I would see the Omega men and the other fraternity men stepping and all the kinds of things that go along with college life. We had a church that exposed us to Bach, Beethoven, and all of the other classical music, but along with the Negro spirituals. So it was a life full of culture that I missed when coming here. I saw the question about what that I experienced that might have been unpleasant. Well, being teased by my peers because of my accent was, I believe, the most hurtful thing. And later I would find out that many of them had only been here 2 weeks before I got here. So it was that kind of thing. But Hartford.
So Dr. Close, if I could, I'm sorry, Dr. Foster, if I could just spin off on something you were talking about a little bit before, in terms of differences between people who made the migration and people who may have stayed at home behind. Wilkerson wrote, quote, that the Blacks who stayed may have been more conciliatory than many of the people in the Great Migration, unquote. And this is for any of you. Do you think that there were fundamental differences between those who went north and those who stayed in the South?
Well, I tried to touch on that earlier,
Yeah,
David.
Yeah.
When I disagree, because when I look back at my family and others, the people who came for economic opportunities, but many that stayed were attached to the family. They didn't want to leave family. The institutions, they had trades. Many had businesses and community status, as I explicated earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And as I have returned often, I have witnessed that those folks who had more education, they had, say, a home or other kinds of things that made them want to stay, they have fared well, in spite of the segregation that they endured prior to the civil rights movement.
One of the comments I just wanted to make on that point too, thank you, Dr. Foster, that I alluded to what was happening in the South, particularly for graduate school education, because education was actually key to a number of families, Black Southern families. Education has always been a real primary thing. Get an education, go for an education. The story of my father was the story of many Black students, Black men and women who wanted to go to graduate school. They were able to do an undergraduate degree, primarily at one of the historically Black colleges. And Dr. Foster mentioned that area, but getting a graduate school education was difficult because the graduate schools meant that you would have to go to one of the white universities. And you were not able to do that. They were segregated. That was still under Plessy, separate but equal, supposedly. But during that period of the 1940s and 50s, Southern states trying to delay a Brown decision for integration, or the 1940s when Thurgood Marshall was looking at that for graduate schools, paid the tuition of Black students to go to northern schools. My father was one of those, but talking to other people, it was across a number of states, in Alabama, in Virginia, in Georgia. They would pay the tuition if you did not try to integrate their schools. So a lot of the students migrated for graduate schools and then went back south. They may not have stayed up north. They got their degrees and went back south. And some did stay, but there was both. So when I alluded to education being a key, that was very much a primary, at least from my family experience.
Dr. Close, do you have anything you want to add? on that subject?
When Dr. Foster talks about those familial connections, they remain true and they remain steadfast. Because when there were bombings in Montgomery and Birmingham, the folks in Hartford from those areas, they not only felt that pain, but they were also willing to go back and march and protest. And for those buses that were funded by travelers in the 60s, there were Hartford people who had migrated to Hartford who went back to be part of those protests. And so the folks down south, I wouldn't say they conciliated. I think they made a stand in a very difficult circumstance. And then for those folks who had migrated, they also had the courage to go back and say, we're with you on this. And that was key. And it wasn't just to Georgia that this happened. It was also to places like Mississippi as well as Alabama. Because when I interviewed the Reverend Bernard Lafayette, he talked about as a college student working for a SNCC and the SCLC, how he would come to Connecticut to get automobiles for the movement, he and other young Black men, and then drive them back down to Mississippi. And that took a tremendous amount of courage to do that on their part. But it also took a tremendous amount of courage on the part of the white Pontiac dealer who also gave them the vehicles that allowed for that. And so what I see with migration, I see it as a rebellion in the air to me, because people are making a stand against Southern segregation, and they're also realizing that their struggle is intimately tied to that of people living and residing in the South still, who are dealing with Jim Crow on a daily basis.
Well, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. King for the same reason, Stacey. Dr. King was here to raise money, and he was with the Reverend Richard A. Battles, who was the pastor at the time, 1963, of the Mount Olive Baptist Church that consisted primarily of people from Georgia. I was standing on a corner in North Hartford, not far from the public housing project that I lived in, and Dr. King and Richard Battles, Reverend Battles, and Tom Butler, who was a classmate of Dr. King's, came over to talk to me and some of my friends and entreated us to stay in high school, to complete high school, and to help him make a better world. But I noted that he was going to meet with other men, working men, blue collar men, who at the time were working in the various factories. And so they were all from Georgia also. And so he was here to raise money, and he was making his way around the community to collect money for the movement. And that was prelude to the March on Washington, as I recall.
Okay, I've got 3 related questions that I'll try to merge into something comprehensible that is sort of a follow-up to some of this. The simplest version is how did Blacks who migrated to Connecticut reflect on their decision years later? A lengthier version is, do you feel that on balance, the Black families who migrated and their children and grandchildren feel they've been more successful, less successful, or about the same, measured economically, culturally, and by their degree of relative happiness compared to their friends or family members who did not migrate? And then I guess the final question to that, and then we'll close for the evening, is do you have a sense, because Wilkerson also writes towards the end of her book in her epilogue, that people who left decades before, and even more likely their children, can't help consider the prospects of a changed South, whether they act on it or not. Has there been a movement of younger generations, you know, to go back South? So take that wherever you like.
As far as the movement back south, I think there's clearly been a movement back south by younger generations as people hear about opportunities. When you hear about the opportunities in and around Charlotte, when you hear about Atlanta and the opportunities there, clearly young people are taking up that opportunity. You also hear about the opportunities that HBCUs provide for you as well. On the issue of happiness, I'll speak specifically with my family because I migrated to Connecticut around 1993, and what I knew of Connecticut was my sense of Connecticut came from watching boxing on Saturday. My family, we're farm family people. And so once we had completed all the work that we needed to do, my grandparents would let us watch boxing. And so every Saturday, it seemed like to me there was boxing from Hartford with Gil Clancy, and I got to learn the name Marlon Starling. And so I thought that Hartford was this boxing mecca on par with New York City. And so when I got an opportunity to come up to interview for a job, I was expecting something a little bit different from what I saw. And what I saw, I liked because I grew up in Southwest Georgia. It was very rural. And I first settled in the eastern part of the state that was very rural. And it was a place where I told my mother, I said, I can drive here. It's kind of laid back and there's opportunity. And I was right in terms of growth in the academic world, as well as finding a community that embraced me. Because for me, it was the Hartford community that I found a connection with. And the people there, from the Fishers to the Alines, to Dr. Foster, Dr. Greene, all those folks I connected with and found a place. And I found a place that allowed me to give a voice to the research that I wanted to do on Blacks who had migrated from South to Connecticut.
Thank you. Dr. Greene, Dr. Foster, anything you want to add?
Well, I've had I have a son who took advantage of educational opportunities, and he found a sweetheart and married in the South. So he did return. Another son who wanted to experience the HBCU. So he just graduated from Hampton University, but will be attending graduate school here. So I know many of my peers who have returned to the South. They were able to make a decent living working in the factories and other places here in Connecticut, and have returned in their old age to their home. And Connie mentioned one of them. One of the spots that they're going to is the area around Columbia, rather, South Carolina, and Hilton Head. And so it's not unusual because other people are doing the same thing. And the young people are going to those areas. We call them the hot spots now, the Research Triangle area, the Triad, and Atlanta, and of course, Northern Virginia. Those are where the techies are going. Those are where the jobs are. And so I think many people were able to do very well here in Connecticut. because of the opportunities to work in the manufacturing industry. And being blessed with good health, they were able to last for 25 to 30 years and earn a pension. And they are now returning to the South.
There is a well-known New York Times writer whose name is slipping my mind, but you will probably tell me in a second, who has written pretty extensively arguing that young Blacks should move back, especially to Georgia and the Carolinas, because strictly on the demographics, if enough people move, it won't take a big swing to change the politics in those states, which I find a fascinating
You're
concept.
referring to Charles Blow.
Yes, Charles Blow.
Charles Blow.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that Dr. Close, being a fellow historian, will agree with me, is that we've seen this rodeo before. And we call it the post-Reconstruction. And we're in fear of that happening again. And so it's going to take a concerted effort to maintain the right to vote. And Blow was writing and articulating that before we've had all of the kinds of things that we're having to contemplate and deal with politically now.
Okay, thanks. All right.
I just wanted to make one quick comment. I think that, as we talk about this, there is a stronger South now, and the historically Black colleges are playing a strong role in that. You can see that even the election in Georgia, I call it the role of the historically Black colleges, as well as sororities and fraternities, Black sororities and fraternities. So the South that I see now is different from the South of before because of this. Students who go down stay. You have climate and everything. So I do think it's a different era, that the North has attraction in one level, but not the same attraction that it may have had, back in the 60s or the 70s.
Thank you I was going to ask you to get your last word in, Connie, so thank you. The other thing I wanted to mention to people who may not be familiar with the acronym HBCU, as you just explained, it stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. So it's probably not an acronym that a lot of the Jewish community is familiar with, but hopefully now they are. Okay. So with that, there is obviously so much more to discuss, but it's time to say goodnight. And so on behalf of the Jewish Community Relations Council and the Jewish Leadership Academy, I want to really thank Dr. Stacey Close, Dr. Constance Belton Green, and Dr. Benjamin Foster for sharing their time and their expertise and their experiences with us. Thank you so much. It was great seeing all of you and hearing from you. I also want to thank everyone who attended tonight's program and the prior two programs in the series, as well as everyone who's been reading along with us over the course of the past few months. And if you missed any of these panels, they are on the Jewish Federation's YouTube channel for future viewing. Tonight's program should be up on the YouTube channel within a few days. We hope you've gained a greater appreciation for a part of American history that so few of us really know about, as well as deepening your commitment to acknowledging and dismantling racism locally and nationally. Finally, many thanks to the team, Jody Angel, Alana Butler, Heather Rubin Fiedler, David Warren, and other members of the Federation staff who helped develop this series of programs, along with Bruce and me and the other members of the program committee, Tracy Tabak, Steve Rabb, Susan Stoppelman, Joe Schubert, Stephen Baer, Elisa Graber-Lipperman, Janet Wallens, Laura Soul, Rabbi Randy Konigsberg, Judy Schlossberg, Becca Stein, and Bob Blitzer. Last but not least, we're also very grateful to Liberty Bank for sponsoring community conversations and to the generous funders of the Jewish Leadership Academy. We hope you will join us for a second series of community conversations, which will be announced and will come launching later this fall, which is going to focus on combating hate in general. Stay tuned for more information. Thank you, good night, and have a really great week.